It was just past midday when the sun finally went dark, the bleeding shadow of our eyes eclipsing it as the comet etched itself ever closer to the inevitable. The end of Arkae, Diner solemnly thought, a sudden spike of pain burning up his ruined arm as he frantically swam along. The end of the Olympus Imperium. The end of our salvation plan, the Tau Vault. Diner's thoughts were ravaged by another surge of anguish ripping its way up his arm. The end of humanity as we know it. This is it. The thought twisted and stagnated in his stomach, screaming louder than his anxiety-ridden wheezing from miles of panicked open-sea swimming. I must make it to the tower, he reminded himself. He did that as many times as he needed to. I must just keep going. I must make it. The end of everything. I must make it. To the tower. The tower is our salvation. This is it. The seawater around him was crimson, reaching out far behind him like a bloody tail wherever he went. Whenever he noticed it, the thought of sharks kept him pushing on. The ocean was cold, but fear burned deep within him. This mortality motivated him far more effectively than any wealth, woman, or will of his own ever could. He could feel the aspect shift around in his Imperium satchel as he swam, a low thrum subtly vibrating from it. Whispering. To Diner, it seemed this was the case at least. The strange rod was adorned with intersecting tentacles, each of them reaching toward a single, lidless eye at the crest of the thing. Fins flanked the eye in some profane mockery of a bird or angel's wings. Countless impenetrable runes or glyphs tattooed the entire surface of it, burning with a sickly pale light. It was the only light that could escape it, for the black surface itself seemed to drink it all in. The butt end was the head of a trident, clearly more for form rather than function. It was completely alien to Diner. Inhuman, just like those monsters he stole it from. Savage, like those same creatures who undoubtedly pursued him, even now, in search of their lost prize. The deep ones known as brynkin to the seafarers of Arkae. Diner's vision blurred, but he pushed forward as something slid past him beneath the water. Instinctively, he thrashed at it in response. Diner's standard-issue warrior's dirk appeared in his good hand, the red sea water around him darkening into a deep shade of wine. He was treading water now, delirious, suddenly seeing the trail of crimson he had cut across the ocean in his mad dash. Diner's blood went cold. They could track me across the ocean if they wanted to, he realized. Brynkin were at least half as smart as man, with a language and society all their own. They had intent and ambition all their own, aside from their carnal and bestial nature. Orcs of the sea, he had once heard a sailor call them. Images flashed in his mind then, unbidden. Their pale eyes, lidless and watching. Their face a mass of gripping, hungry tentacles, stripping flesh from bone. A wide-set jaw of shark teeth beneath it all, resting atop a hulking and neckless body. Their grotesque, hunched forms scrambling across the deck as Diner's comrades stood frozen in disbelief. Their mandibles peeling back skin as razor teeth ripped away the majority of his hand in the mad struggle, but it was the only way Diner could get the aspect away from their leader. Worth it, he told himself. Though, I'll never forget the sound of my brothers screaming as they devoured them all. Then, another thought came unbidden, still clear even through Diner's fading consciousness. How am I still alive? He raised the remains of his hand over his head, eclipsing the blackening sun above him. The comet our eyes bore down over the entire world like a burning, gory sword, the blood of the gods spilling across the sky, just as Diner's own spread out across the sea. It was the mighty spear of the heavens, the Doomsinger. I must just keep going, he reminded himself. This is it, I must make it. He continued forward, ignoring something else sliding up against him beneath the water. The end of everything. He pushed on, more labored than before. I must make it. This is it. His breath grew heavy, but the tower vault finally came into view. It was closer than the horizon, which made Dinair wonder if it was just a figment, or how long he had been this close to it. To the tower. Its high spire reached well above the clouds, as dozens of airships docked at various levels across the entire structure. Color drained away from the world, the edges of Dinair's vision creeping in, but it took nothing away from the masterful designs burning across the surface of the vault. The tower is our salvation, he told himself. The spire encompassed an entire peninsula of land upon the coast, thrusting out like a rebellious knife into the heavens. Built to withstand an apocalypse, large enough to house a civilization. Then, Dinair's vision went black, consciousness finally slipping away from him. When Dinair awoke, he was dry, sprawled out across a medical table in an infirmary on the bottom level of the tower vault as doctors wordlessly poured over him. They were like ghosts, dressed in their white scrubs. Faceless wraiths working mechanically and methodically at the ruins of his arm. He felt nothing, the sedative made sure of that, but it did little else to dull the nightmares flashing before his eyes. Everything was a blurry miasma, a fever dream. Still, Dinair wondered if the doctors knew he had even awoken at all, for it wasn't a lack of drugs that stirred him from death. It was a sudden and urgent call, a beckoning he felt down to his bones. An urge, a need, a thirst, a lust. It was all he could do but think of one thing and one thing alone, the aspect. Where is it? He found himself thinking, eyes dancing around the room as urgently as he had swam across the ocean. He searched past his looming ghosts, who by some miracle still had not noticed his consciousness. Then, he found it. Beside his winged Imperium helm and matching satchel, upon a silver table in the corner of the room, was the trident rod he didn't realize he had coveted so much. Without a second thought, he found his body already in motion. Dinair leapt from the medical table, the ghosts all around him shrieking and recoiling away. It wasn't until he was on his feet did he realize just how sedated he still was. He saw tubes running out of his arms in several places, each of them where a needle was nested delicately into his flesh. His vision was fading, and with it, Dinair's sense of balance. Moaning, he pushed forward as the wraiths all struggled against him. There was a flash of white. Then Dinair could feel the cold silver tile of the chamber floor pressed up against his face. His head was swimming and he could feel the ghosts all tugging at him from different directions. Then, an unknown amount of time later, he was on the medical table again. He was already sitting up, a doctor spooning a sweet, dark liquid into his mouth. Dinair choked on it, suddenly coming to. What happened? Relax, a soothing female voice suggested. Dinair traced it to a younger nurse, who had already been carrying his belongings over to him. We were hoping you might have the answer to that. You're lucky to be alive, let alone within the walls of the vault. They stopped accepting refugees days ago, but I guess waterlogged soldiers are an exception. Her hair was the color of seashells, and she smelled of roses. Her voice was like a dove's song to him. Dinair was so thankful for her, to bring him so close to the aspect again. Soldiers will be required for the new age, he grunted back at her. Waterlogged or not. A wash of relief melted over Dinair, as she placed the rod down beside him. He ignored the look she had chiseled into her face. Part of him was thankful for his winged helm as well, he had to admit. If what I suspect is true, he thought. He slid his helm back over the top of his head, then Dinair held his mangled arm out in front of himself to inspect. Amputated below the elbow, he noted, attempting to calculate the distance he must have swam. Dinair could still feel the aspect humming, nestled it into the crook of his good arm, as he reconstituted himself. The nurse gave him another suspicious look. I can tell what you're thinking. Your arm was pretty infected. Barely recognizable, if I'm honest. She cleared her throat, eyeing the soldier up and down as he continued to stare at the aspect. We're, surprised you're still alive. I must speak with Emperor Mindor concerning this. Dinair held the tentacle-adorned rod out for them all to see, and it's singular, I watched them all back. I have seen things. Things not of the impending impact of the comet Ariz, nor the endless siege outside the gates of the vault. Wraiths from the underworld, my love. My love, the nurse whispered instinctively, more to herself. Her eyes searched for something, like Dinair's words had evoked her darkest secrets. Her gaze eventually found him again, when she caught herself drifting away. It does look unlike anything I've ever laid eyes on. I'll summon an officer for you then. Dinair continued past her words. It is beyond all our mortal comprehension. She nervously shifted her weight. Right? Dinair didn't care what she thought, he realized. Maybe it was the sedative, but he was well beyond caring what anyone thought. Truth be told, he could barely remember anything at all beyond his battle against the sea. It seemed to him that little else mattered, now that he had the aspect again. By the time he was dressed in a fresh uniform, for lack of an arm, an officer escort had already arrived. Only officers and higher had the proper credentials to travel between levels, a required escort for anyone otherwise. The officer, a young man with a golden beard past his chest, inspected Dinair eagerly. This must be our wounded wolf who comes home in the 11th hour, I assume. The man's cheeks had a color to them that reminded Dinair of a sunrise. Quickly, you must tell me everything on the way to see General the Nars. She can decide if your case is worthy of the Emperor. What was it? Some trinket you've discovered? His voice was musical when he spoke, like no darkness could faze him. No matter, it wouldn't be the first time the Emperor has seen someone over a relic. His hair looked as if it was sunlight made flesh, almost glowing. I am Officer Aplo, pleasure to meet you. Aplo's smile was warm, but never stole a second away from Dinair's dark thoughts about the aspect. After you, then. The officer revealed a small, arrowhead-shaped object made of gold from beneath his military jacket. Veins of crystal cut their way through the tiny object, playing in the flat light of the infirmary. The vault is at maximum capacity. Aplo jovially declared, thrusting the arrowhead into a slat in the wall. A back door revealed itself, the section of wall seemingly melting away before them. It led into the balcony area high above the ground floor and soars. Dinair took note of which pocket officer Aplo tucked the trinket away in. Droves of family units are being processed as we speak, the officer continued as they walked across the balcony level together. When Dinair looked below, he could see the truth of Aplo's words. A huge crowd had formed to press against a choke point formed by Imperium warriors. One by one, each family unit was inspected, any weapons confiscated, then divided into tiny dwellings carved out of the ground and underlevels. The men of age were immediately brought to the military wing, just beneath the balcony Dinair and Aplo walked across. These brothers and fathers would be among the first. Recruits for the new age, after Ariz would finally come to rest. The people will all need a civilized folk to lead them, Dinair couldn't help but think. When all else is gone. The historians had long predicted the coming of Ariz, which gave man enough time to construct the Tower Vault. It would serve as a seed from which civilization would sprout from the ashes of this old age. There have been an unfortunate amount of refugees left on the outside, Aplo continued, but they fight on for us against the Orcish and Rathucan hordes on our doorstep, regardless. Fodder or otherwise. The officer let out a soft chuckle, exhaling. What was it some of the orcs have been known to say? They'll be reborn, something or other. Come the Thor, Dinair corrected. APoF cleared his throat. They'll be reborn, come the Thor. There, it's done then. He pressed the golden arrowhead into another slat in a wall they came to, and another door revealed itself, and melted into a winding stairway upward. After you. The stairs snaked their way up, causing Dinair to think of the aspect again. The tentacles slithering up the sides of its dark surface, kissing against the central lidless eye at the top. All light around it seeming to shrink into it, devoured by it. That consistent black hum, darker than the light-eating surface of the object itself. An inverted aura, Dinair mused. By the time they reached the end of the stair, an exit outside, Dinair found himself cradling the aspect in his good arm again. From the outside level, they were free to see the final horizon of this age. From here, they could also access the control area, officer quarters, and bear witness to Ariz as it inexorably drew nearer. You're bigger now than when we last met, Lord Ariz, Dinair found himself thinking. This setup of new levels into functional areas leading to balcony areas, into upper outside balconies with specialty areas and access to the next level, was how the vault continued all the way to the top. Each layer was progressively more important than the last, Emperor Mindor himself in the royal penthouse at the peak. The aspect came to life as they stepped into the open air of the outside balcony, those alien runes swelling with dark light across the entire surface. That low humming had melted into a steady droning, but APoF continued to ramble on as if nothing was happening. They approached one of the open ledges of the tower, APoF gesturing out to the horizon as the open sea raged against the side of it. The officer seemed happy as he rambled on, nodding here and there with a grin set too wide across his hideous face. Officer APoF had suddenly become tainted to Dinair. A sick feeling overcame him, the same feeling one might get when faced with a rat or a cockroach. A feeling of dread determination. Of dark obligation. What is this creature that stands before me? He could hear himself think, a fresh wave of disgust washing over him. A shrill scream rose up out of the ocean, calling to him. Doesn't he hear it? A voice hissed within Dinair's mind. Then, he realized it was his own. The aspect was out in front of him now, that central eye burning and swirling with darkness, as those black tentacles seemed to writhe all around it. It blazed with 1,000 different colors, and none, casting an inverted halo upon Officer APoF like some profane curse. An indicator. The aspect was screaming now. Demanding. Dinair's body moved with a will of its own, or perhaps it had been Dinair's will after all. The entire world melted away, as Dinair's mind escaped his body. Everything blurred and swirled into darkness and blood. Eyes and mouths opened up all around him, watching and laughing as they licked lustily with cackling anticipation. He felt himself lunge again, then Dinair's ruined arm went hot. Burning. The world went cold. He could feel a river of wet running up his arm. Everything began to come into focus again, as Dinair returned to himself. First, the comet Ariz burning high above like an ever-watching eye wreathed in shadow. Then, Officer APoF, a look of sheer terror frozen on his tensing face, eyes bulging with surprise. Dinair had thrust his ruined arm into the officer's neck, the bone ripping through his freshly dressed incision to push its way into APoF's flesh. The crimson tendrils worming their way across the surface of his arm began to thicken, then flow freely. They both stood there in this moment of disbelief, until APoF was finally forced to gurgle for fresh air. His golden beard ran redder than a setting sun as a curtain of crimson poured out of the officer's mouth. Dinair pushed his arm deeper into Officer APoF's neck, then kicked him over the edge of the tower vault balcony. He clutched something in his fist, Dinair realized, looking down at his own hand as if it were someone else's. When he spread out his fingers, he found the golden arrowhead APoF had used to access each of the areas, glistening in the scarlet storm brewing overhead. The sky was totally dark now, and soon our eyes would come to rest. Dinar's vision was clear, a flood of memories battering at him. Visions of weeks of torture and bliss by the hands of his Brynkin captors. A blurred fever dream of a promise made and blood paid to this accursed idol he held so dearly. The aspect continued to watch as it all came screaming back to him, all at once. Then, he knew what he must do. Not a survivor, he remembered, I was set loose. Dinar thrust the golden key into the slot, and a doorway revealed itself. It led to the control area, where half a dozen terminals lined the room and thrice as many workers carried on in absent focus. Wordless, he advanced, aspect in his good hand, unresponsive to any pain that might be present from the exposed bone on his ruined arm. Blind focus drove him, gave purpose to each step. By the time any of the workers took note of the bloody, one-armed soldier, who had stumbled into the control area, it was already too late. I need not but to touch it, Dinar thought as he held the cursed cyclopean rod to one of the work terminals. There was a sudden flash, purple and red lightning surging across the light-eating surface of the aspect. The black droning emanating from the idol, that only Dinar seemed to be able to hear, suddenly revealed itself to the entire command chamber. One by one, each of the workers fell to the floor, screaming and clawing at their ears with eyes. Dancing. Many bit off their own tongues, others leapt through the balcony window overlooking the bottom levels. It did not matter who witnessed what would happen now. Let them all witness, Dinar hissed. Let me bear witness as well. He watched as the aspect's intersecting tentacles unfurled, spreading out wide as the idol floated into the air on its own volition. The eye continued to watch Dinar as the sickly, alien runes came to life across its dark surface. The air bent around it, blurring at the edges, until there was nothing. Then, all Dinar could see was white. All he could hear was a high whistle, ringing in his ear where the aspect's droning had previously been. All he could feel was the filthy stone floor of the command chamber pressed up against his cheek and hand. But, slowly, it all came back to him. The ringing faded away, the idol's song returning like a long-lost lover. He could see again, though the command chamber had gone dark. The aspect floated before the shattered balcony observation windows, as if it watched the chaos it had wrought down below with pride. It did not watch, though, Dinar knew, for the eye remained ever fixed upon him, no matter where he stood in the command chamber. Each of the work terminals sparked periodically, clearly soiled from whatever the aspect had unleashed. Those workers who had thrashed around before now lay dead in a pool of their own blood and bile, most of them with their eyes clawed out. When Dinar looked through the observation windows to the lower levels, he saw a symphony of slaughter. Power to the entire tower vault had been cut. The moment that happened, saw vents leading out were opened to a hungry swarm of Brynkin lying in wait just outside. They worked their way up through the saw levels, and continued to do so, even now as Dinar looked on. They worked their way through the cornered refugee families, as the Imperium warriors were forced to make the decision to fight or flee. Most flee, and it's in vain. The monstrous Brynkin, deep ones from the frigid seas of Arkae. They flood in to feast on the tender humans within the tower vault, like cracking open a ripened fruit. Each of them was larger than the average man, hulking, hunched frame pulling themselves along quadrupedally on webbed talons. Their tentacle faces hid their hungry jaws, but the appendages themselves still served to restrain and rip. They could survive some time outside the water, but with access to the sea via saw it did not matter in the end. It was a banquet of blood for the old gods of Arkae, not these pretenders who hide upon the surface world. But those who survived, time and time again, whenever Ariz the Doomsinger awoke from his ancient slumber. No man, woman, nor child was spared as they continued to pour forth from the deep. They would all be enslaved, devoured, read, gifted, domesticated. Dinair retched across the stone floor of the command chamber, suddenly disgusted with what he had done. Sobriety was setting in, shot with painful visions and emotions he found nearly impossible to grapple with. His screams rang out over everything as the pain of his exposed bone finally set in. As quickly as he could, Dinair ripped away a section of his uniform, frantically wrapping it around his bad arm until no air could touch the wound. That much would have to serve, he needed not but to dull it. Dinair stood before the aspect, that sickly, cold light of its glyphs cutting inverted silhouettes against the black surface of the idol as it hovered there with otherworldly confidence. The thrumming returned, louder than ever, as the central eye at the top of the rod bore into him. The tentacles retracted to how they had previously been, intersecting and slithering their way to the top. Even now, it still amazed Dinair as he watched it move, for to him it had felt like stone when he touched it. He sought to touch it once more, one last time, and the aspect allowed for it. Dinair plucked the cursed idol from the air, and without a second thought, made a mad dash to the exit of the command chamber. It wasn't until he emerged that it realized what he intended, and the aspect bore the full weight of its will upon him. He let out a cry as a shrill, piercing screech echoed into Dinair's ears. With it came the weight of misery, of fear, and of pain. A deeper pain, down to the core of his heart. Pressure built behind his eyes until he was sure that they would burst at any moment. And his flesh, the very skin on his own back, suddenly repulsed him. It was the most uncomfortable he had ever felt, like it was a parasitic creature, writhing across and constricting his body. Dinair's bones turned to glass, the incessant droning dissolving into a scream that drowned out all else. With his good arm, he drug himself across the cobblestones of the outside balcony, toward the edge where Officer Aplo had found his end. Each inch was agony, his own thoughts betraying him with all manner of nightmares and lies. Demons flashed before him, his wildest dreams laid bare to halter every bitter step. Every sin committed, every injustice, every act of cowardice, all of it twisted and cast upon him for the idol's own amusement. Or for its desperation. The sky was black, our eyes now close enough to dissolve away even the clouds themselves, and left as the only visible cosmic body above. This is it, Dinair managed to focus through his scattered thoughts, through the pain and the anxiety that cursed rod was subjecting him to. This is it, he affirmed. The ground beneath the tower began to shake mightily, the sea stirring visibly even on the far-off horizon. Boiling. The tower vault itself began to shake, but the aspect did not let up its assault. Dinair crawled forward as airships fell out of the sky around the tower. The world was unraveling, but he had but one mission in life left to do. This is it, I must reach the edge, he thought. Inch by inch, he approached, leaving a greasy red trail behind himself as Dinair pulled himself along. He had to stop and catch his breath from the immense pain from time to time, but eventually he found the edge. He realized, then, that most of his teeth had broken in the struggle. Some deeper part of his connection with the aspect must have told it that its attack on him had failed, because the droning ceased. It allowed for this moment of catharsis, as they watched the world fall into cataclysm together. Dinair looked into the apocalyptic eye of that unholy idol, and it looked back. So, he said, voice breaking, my atonement shall be keeping an evil such as yourself hidden from the world. The new age can be reborn, pure. With that, Dinair cast the profane aspect over the side of the tower vault. It screamed through the air, end over end, as our eyes finally made its final kiss upon the horizon of Arkae. A flash of white erupted, temporarily blinding all who bore witness to the blast. The earth opened up beneath the tower, and the vault itself buckled as the sea rushed into the newly formed crevasse. When the shockwave finally hit, Dinair took the opportunity to leap into the air himself. This is it, he thought, as everything collapsed all around him, free falling. A wall of water rose up, blocking out any light that might have been left in the world, intent on drowning out whatever remained of the monument man had built to usher in the new age. As Dinair fell through the air, he could still feel the aspect calling out, somewhere far below. This world would be wiped away, cleansed, its memory scattered. Reborn again. Before another thought could find him, the ground rushed up and found him first, and Dinair could finally rest. At the top of the world was Arkae's throne, a tower of man-made might. Like a jewel of old upon a steel crown, it was a vault of man's survival. Then Ariz awoke, and like a burning sword he cleaved apart the night. The sun turned to woe before the tower fell, and none were left alive. It began with a spark upon a starlit sky. Man would wonder why. A new idea was born to help them weather the storm, and humanity would unite. But the gods had been scorned, and every sin must atone, so Ariz blackened out the sky. Then the stars above fell like the tower below as the ocean opened wide. Humanity had learned like many times come before they can't be saved by pride. And thus was the story of humanity's plight. The ocean rose up and turned day into night. Upon the horizon a godly fire burned bright. Salvation was breached and none were left alive.